Welcome, folks. Just want to let you know we'll give another minute or two for a few more people to join. Just a reminder, like last time, part one, we are recording tonight so that folks who aren't able to attend live will be able to view the video later. So just to keep that in mind. We've got everybody muted in the audience, but we will open the chat, and Colleen and Andrew will monitor the chat, and we'll try to see if we can save some time today to really answer some of your questions from the chat. So thank you for joining us. We'll get going. It's 7:35. We'll get going now, and other folks can kind of join in as they're able. Welcome to our PTA Council Community Conversation, Montclair Public Schools Budget Presentation Part 2. Again, we are grateful to have our Superintendent, Dr. Jonathan Pons, our Business Administrator, Mr. Amidio DeAndrea, and our Supervisor of Accounting, Ms. Melissa Beatty. This is the brain trust that's been working, as they indicated at our last meeting since as early as October to develop the budget that is before the Board of School Estimates now. They had their first of 2 required public hearings this past Monday. The second public hearing will be this coming Monday, and then on April 4th, they will vote on this year's budget, but the goal of the 5th, right? April 5th?
Yes, 5th.
The goal of this meeting is not to talk about the fiscal year 21-22 budget. There is still an opportunity for folks to offer public comment or ask their questions about that budget on Monday at the Board of School Estimates meeting, but just to kind of teach folks how the budget process works and how the district goes about building and developing a budget. So last time we talked a lot about the governance structure of the Montclair Public School District with our appointed Board of Education and our Board of School Estimates and their respective roles in the budget process. We talked about the state's 2% cap on increases to tax levy revenue and how that impacts the district. And Dr. Pons talked about how important it is to try to be entrepreneurial and find other opportunities for new revenue through available grants, because it's very, very hard in the regulatory context that we have. To increase your revenue to keep up with the pace of rising costs. And just, before we dive into budget development, I always find it's helpful to kind of listen to the meetings and hear some of the questions that reflect common misunderstandings that I've often heard within the community about how the budget process works. So one comment from the Board of School Estimates meeting on Monday that I just wanted to use to kind of tee up the discussion is something that I hear a lot. And this was, one of my daughter's teachers, who's a wonderful teacher and just a great, great person. But she said, it's frustrating because every year it seems like we have a multi-million-dollar budget deficit, and I don't understand why that is. It has to be the result of under budgeting or overspending. That's a common misconception, and we're trying to help folks understand why that is. And you'll recall, for those of you who attended last time, that we talked about the difference between budget management or execution of the current year budget on the one hand, and budget development or budget projection of next year's budget on the other hand. What the district does not do and cannot do is overspend their budget. So they are not spending at a deficit in the current fiscal year, and they haven't in any of the prior fiscal years either. In fact, every year they end the year with an operating surplus. That surplus may be a couple of $100,000, it may be a couple of $1 million, but the district never overspends the budget. They may have some lines within the budget that they realize halfway through the year, we're going to be a little bit short in this line, so we need to find another line in the budget. The example Melissa always likes to use is custodial overtime. You budget based on past trends and what your spending is going to be on custodial overtime, but then you get hit with 6 huge snowstorms and you have to call in all of your custodians overnight on the weekends to clear out all the snow, and all of a sudden you busted through that budget. So you need to transfer money from another line. Maybe you have a staff position that was budgeted for the full year, but the hiring process took longer than you anticipated. So it was vacant for September and October. So you've accrued some money in that salary line. Or you realize that you're not going to spend everything that you put in the budget for judgments against the district because those numbers are coming in lower this year. So the business office can identify, or other offices can identify, we need to transfer money from one line to another. But I do want to, let folks know that the district cannot and does not overspend its budget. The reason why we tend to have, every time when Amidia or the prior business administrators like myself have presented the preliminary budget projection in February, they're presenting a budget that has a gap based on a projection. From October through February, they're going through this process of trying to determine what needs to be in the budget next year and what is it going to cost next year. And some of that is science and you know exactly what it's going to cost next year, and some of it is art. You have to estimate what it's going to cost next year, but you add all of those lines together and that's your expenditures. And then on the revenue side, generally, you're going to increase your tax levy, which is 90% of your budget, by 2%. And most of your other aid is going to remain relatively flat. And you look at those projected revenues and those projected expenditures, because the costs of so many items in the budget grow every year. And that's what creates the budget gap, not under budgeting, not overspending, but just that natural kind of projected growth of the cost of what we buy on the expenditure side, including staffing and benefits, out of district tuitions, utilities, insurance, and the limitations on which we can grow on the revenue side, at least on the tax levy. So I just wanted to start with that clarification, because today we're going to dive deeper into this budget development process. How does the district determine what needs to be in the budget next year and how much that is going to cost? So I wanted to start in the fall, I think, because that's Amidia, when you said you really start preparing the budget. So what are you doing in October, and how are you engaging the principals as building leaders and the heads of the various central office departments in terms of getting their input as to what needs to be in the budget next year?
So generally, the process that not only myself but many school districts use is that we basically have a budget manual. In the budget manual, they are given very specific parameters as to information that they should be gathering, and then it gives them the number of students being estimated for the following year. What we do here in Montclair is we allocate a dollar value for elementary schools, a dollar value for middle, a dollar value for high school. And then based on their enrollment, that is the money that's been allocated to their buildings to develop their location-based budget. And in their location-based budget, it's mainly textbooks and supplies. They do not get involved with the staffing for the purpose of developing the budget at the local level. So if you were to look at our budget, and Melissa's done a phenomenal job, we are not only broken down by location. Some of our budgets are broken down by subject area and some are broken down by grade level. So if we needed to know at any point in time how much money is, and I'm just using an example, art, there is a way to run the report based on the coding of how much money is being spent on art, phys ed. So in Montclair, the numbers are so finite that we can look at those items. But the building principals are allowed to develop their budgets. And what I do ask in my budget development process is that if you're making a request for anything that is new, above and beyond what you've done in prior years, we ask them to identify that by actually putting in the budget development the word new. So that when we're going through the budget, we know that here's a request for something new. That becomes an item that automatically starts a discussion as to why is this needed at this point in time. We also then look for consistency. If someone makes a mention they're looking to do something new, well, is this something that it should be only developed new at the building level and one building? Or should this require a larger discussion amongst all of the elementaries to say, is this something we should implement district-wide? So that's why I always ask to put the word new. It gives us two facets of it. You know exactly that there's something new they're looking for, and does it require further discussion? So that is how the principals in the building levels are determined their budget. When you get into the department budgets, custodian, maintenance, equity, curriculum, and instruction, they follow somewhat of a different pattern. And they're, a lot of the times, they look at historical information to determine how their budgets get developed. So custodial and maintenance, it's kind of more or less historical information. You can never really predict how much money you're going to need for repairs and maintenance. And you can look back and see where you trended. But again, that's also broken down by location because we're required to file an annual report as to how much we spent on each building, and that's required to be submitted to the state. Equity, curriculum, and instruction develop their budget based on what they see the needs for bringing forward a good educational program for the next year. That could include investigating and looking at a new textbook series. So they implement that. They develop professional development based on their plans for the following year as to what professional development that is needed. So each department has their own way of looking at moving forward with the budget process. I can tell you probably one of the most difficult areas, and it's so fluid, is the out-of-district placement. I cannot tell you how many times I've been working on a budget that I've worked with the director and they walk in and say, well, here's my out of district tuition students. And the next day they walk in and said, we just had 2 new kids walk in. And one of them is at a residential. A residential cost could be $115,000. In a district of Montclair, that's a hit, but it's not as drastic in the earlier part of my career when I was in a district of a $25 million budget. Think of a $25 million budget and you get a line item for $115,000 the day after you develop your budget. So when you're dealing with special services, that is such a fluid number. What I've always done is said, this is set in time. We pick the cutoff date. The number of students that are in the buildings at that time is the budget. Generally, you add about 10% is where I usually go for their tuition and any additional services they provide. And unless you have something truly, truly drastic that changes, you stay with that number because it's so fluid, and you hope for the following year that it does not drastically change. And you try to put some contingencies into the budget to the best of your abilities. We generally try to look at students that we know are definitely graduating. So you try to make those adjustments. But again, if you're pulling them out, someone graduating, you also have to need someone coming in. So it's a back and forth. The other big items We've already talked about several times. Transportation, historically, if you can renew your contracts, your CPI is usually around 2%. So you try to stay within that unless you specifically know you're making changes to your transportation format, then you may budget a little bit more. But the last few years, the CPI has been about 1.7, 1.8 around there. But you budget too, and you try to go from there. The next big ticket item is obviously health benefits and uh, health benefits and developing your health benefits. Montclair, like many other school districts, we work with an insurance consultant. Although we're each knowledgeable in various areas of finance, I can share insurance is not that area for myself. I understand it. I can sit down, read a report, understand how experience rating occurs. But when forecasting forward, insurance is a tricky program to look at. Uh, the interesting part is with insurance, generally the insurance company on a renewal basis to get very low renewal numbers. They want to see you on an annual basis only use between 70 to 75% of your premium to pay out claims. So for every dollar you pay, they only want you to spend 70 to 75 cents on that dollar. Once you start creeping above that 75 cents on the dollar, then your numbers start to creep in for their inflationary numbers because they're also forecasting that they have to somehow make sure that they're managing their company to move forward. So on an annual basis, what we do is we sit with our insurance broker. They prepare a 12-month analysis and they look back for 12 months and determine what's your experience rating. And basically, experience rating is just simply how much did you pay in premium? How much did you take in claims? And the closer you get to that 100%, the uglier the premium renewal becomes. And obviously, if you go above 100%, then it's really a time that you have to start considering. There, the toughest part about health insurance in school districts more than anything else is that when you're out to market, you must market it, and any competitive pricing that comes in must be of equal or greater value than the program that you're currently offering. So we don't have the ability to say, you know what, we want to change a hospital visit from $100 copay up to $200 copay. What's the decremental cost of saving that change? We don't have that ability as an employer to just make those changes. We have contract obligations that we must adhere to. And the clause that's in most contracts is the equal to or better. So if you're looking to make any changes that impact the benefit package, you have to negotiate that at the table. So that's how insurance is renewed on an annual basis. And again, we sit with the broker, and what we normally do is sit early December for the first round. And then I generally try to sit with them again in mid-February, right before we're finalizing the budget to come down to what we feel is a good estimate of where we are. Now, the toughest part is that it's only an estimate, it's a guess. Until you truly go out to market and you find out where the competitors are really looking to be, gives you an indication of how well you can do. Last year was a very unique situation. Um, the Board of Education was faced with a true dilemma. We were in the middle of a pandemic and we had a current provider, Blue Cross Blue Shield. But we were out to market and another competitor came in with a much better pricing. There was a deep conversation that went on with the Board of Ed as to how can we do this? We're in the middle of a pandemic, changing carriers. So we went, poof, Melissa, somewhere into late, late May, late mid to
Yeah.
late May before we made a final decision, because we kept going back to Blue Cross Blue Shield and saying, you have to come down. You have to come down with your premium restructuring. And in the end, they just weren't willing to come down. Our experience rating was not phenomenal, but we had another player in Aetna who was looking for the business, and they took over. The board finally decided to go with Aetna, and I'm happy to report we did well in the conversion, transferring from one plan to the other. There were not many complaints that came with it, and I still think that the plan that's given by Aetna is definitely equal to or better than the Blue Cross Blue Shield. And we're out to market right now, looking at our numbers and working through. The last piece that Brian mentioned is certain things are very set and definitive, and those are your salary contracts. And that is true when you're in a contract year where the following year is already settled. Uh, Through our software program, we're able to take everyone's current salary who sits on a guide in one of the union contracts, and we can basically take that salary and move it forward based on the guide requirement. So if you're at step 4 this year, the system automatically puts you on step 5 that already has a dollar amount. So when you're in a contract year that's settled, when you get into a situation that we currently have, you don't have a settled contract. So what are you doing? You're estimating what you think you can settle at. And even that comes with somewhat of a science, in that we have a New Jersey School Boards Association that does a lot of research on contracts and contract settlements. And they tell us, based on their research, where contracts are settling in the state. And they can even tell you specifically where contract settlements are coming in within your county. They show you the high end of salaries, the low end of salary, so that you can adjust and see where you are. So with salaries, some years there's a very specific science. You know it, contract settled, you move them forward. Other years you have to estimate a dollar amount, and with everything you can do, you try your best to settle within those parameters. And again, for a district of this size, a 1/4% in the salary negotiations could be a large dollar amount,
Okay.
depending on how you settle. Health benefits. If you budget 9 and you come in at 10, that's a large number in the end. So you're trying your best to make sure that you're conservative in your approach and develop numbers that are going to meet your required development of your budget. So that's kind of the global way of how we develop our budget. So they get their budget manual, they have parameters, timelines, and the nice part is in the modern age that we're in, all of our budget development is what I like to call live. So through our software, the staff members, the principals are given access to the budget software. So they input their budget right into our software system. So as soon as it's inputted into the system, the administration can see everything that's been developed by the principals and the department heads. And then once we get to that date, we shut down the system. And then at that point, only adjustments that get made to the budget are normally by Melissa and myself as we go through it. And generally what we do is a process that I like to do is that I actually date, whenever I make an adjustment to the budget line item, I actually put the date that I did the adjustment. I indicate admin. I try to give a description as to what the adjustment is, so that a year from now, 2 years from now, you may go back and reference that budget line item. And by making those notation, it gives us an idea of the initial budget. Was there a cut made? Was there an addition made? And I'll use an example from last year at the Board of School Estimates. The Board of School Estimates asked, and we did do it, that additional money be transferred to support a program. The day after, when I went in, I made the notation, the date, but it read Board of School Estimates, so that the notation is there now in writing as to how did we put additional money on that line item. Well, it was not initiated by the admin. It was really initiated by the Board of School Estimates meeting. So that's how I'd like to develop budgets, so that you can always go back and reference what occurred. And as much as we understand the budget and know it, sometimes that little reference just clicks something in your head and you say to yourself, oh, that's right, that's what we did there. But by having those notations, it helps at times. So it's part of the process, and it gives everybody the ability to know, well, who made that adjustment? Well, the principal made it, because sometimes they make recommendations after the fact. So it's how I like to use it. And then obviously, as Brian said, in the end, we get our revenue numbers from the state. We always sit there and pray around the 25th of February that the numbers come out and we see this whopping large increase in state aid and all of our problems are solved. Uh,
How
but
often
we
does
haven't been that fortunate. What's
that
that, Brian?
How often does that actually happen?
Not often, but I can tell you I'm always intrigued when the list comes out of how much some districts got additional state aid. And then you sit and you look and say, well, what happened to us?
Yeah.
So then the toughest part is that I call that the 11th hour, because we're a type 1 school district. Our budget is usually due within 10 days of the release of
Right.
state aid.
Much earlier than type 2 school districts have
Right.
to.
Where the type 2 is usually due in late April. So at that point in time, we get our state aid numbers, and that's where the hard work starts to really come down, working with the various administrators to say, okay, where do we have to go? This year was a very challenging year in that the state also did not allow for a waiver for health benefits. And that's usually a waiver that you qualify for so you can exceed the 2% tax levy cap. Because the state health benefits did not go up drastically at all, we couldn't apply for a waiver. We don't have waivers for enrollment growth because we don't really have enrollment growth occurring in Montclair. There is a term called bank capping, a cap banking.
Banked cap.
Bank cap. There you go.
Yeah.
It's late. We've exhausted that in prior years, so we don't have anything. So state aid is predominantly flat. Taxes can only go up by 2%, $2.4 million. We had some extra surplus we allocated. So on revenue side, we only grew by 2.9. And part of the presentation that we showed is that $2.9 million was absorbed just basically in our salary forecasts for staffing. And again, we used the analogy, if $80 million in salary grows by 3%, that's 2.4 million. But we only had 2.9 in revenue growth. Anything after that, now you're in your deficit.
Right.
And that was part of the biggest challenge we faced this year in our development, is that our growth of expenses have far exceeded the growth in revenue.
Not just this year, that's what keeps happening.
Yes, it does. But this year it was kind of harder because we didn't have the ability to file for any waivers
Right.
to help support it in that, because as Deputy Mayor Herlock indicated at the Board of School Estimates, with the growth of health benefits on a yearly basis at the rates that they're growing, it's going to be virtually impossible for districts and municipalities to maintain with that. And we can look at other avenues. We could go to a state health benefits program. We have a meeting coming up with our brokers. What I normally do is we ask them to show us the comparison to the state health benefits plan, to see how our current premiums bear to the state health benefits number. And if the numbers are warranted, that's a negotiating item to bring to the table, because the Board of Education does not have the ability to just say, we're going to go over to the state health benefits plan, because it does not necessarily meet the requirements of equal to or better.
Right.
So those are some of the challenges in the budget development. And what I like to do is, Dr. Pons, on the educational side, talk about how you work with the administrators on the educational program. You're on mute. You're still on mute, Dr. Pons. Tess, can you unmute him?
Tessie, are you able to unmute him?
Not yet,
All right,
Jonathan. Hold
there
on.
we
There
go.
you go.
There you go.
So educationally, what you try to do is look at your goals, where you want to be. It's always long term. You bridge what you talk about as the district goals or the board goals. You also bridge in what you believe is the district goals, and then you start forming programs around that. But one thing I do as a superintendent and a superintendent principal, and talk about a small budget. We had a very small budget in my last district, so an increase in healthcare was significant. So we had to find ways of supplementing the budget tons of times. So one thing you try to do first and foremost is look at your grants, what grants you have, and how can you save your budget using grants, using grant funding, and do it thoughtfully. And the media is very kind. He says flat funding for the state. Well, I've been with this state for a few years, and we only budget 80% of what the state will say they'll give you, because what happens many times, this is not one of the years, you get less than the money you think you're going to get 100%. So we do those kind of things, but you look at professional development, you look at things like Title IV has been really used well for like behavioral systems, mental health, Title II, Title III, ESL students, language acquisition. Title II is more around more like Title I, around these other pieces of budgeting around instruction and programming. You find what you can do with that money. One thing I love doing with is professional development. I believe investing in people with that money is the best thing to do, because that continues to pay itself over and over and over and over and over again. Worst thing you can do is give that money back, because when you give it back, they think you need less.
Yep.
And they don't allow you typically it's only allow you to keep, I think, 10% of it if you can justify it.
15.
15% if you can justify it.
Mhm.
So that's my first strategy. But you always, for me personally, I focus with that on, and that's how I look at the four goals. So I'll talk about things like reading. So I believe reading is a major capacity. So we would fund an ongoing professional development for years off those grants, knowing we get a certain amount of money to fund for our PD department. Use this as your grant. Use the grant money over and over again to fund this piece. Program around behavior and emotional health, we'd fund that through Title IV over and over again, so we'd have an idea. But as you get better at what you do down your progression, you actually use less money, because your first year or two is when you use most of the money. Then what you try to do then is supplement it off other pieces. So that's the first thing I do. But you can't make a judgment call of what you think is important unless you have a plan. Unless you have a plan. Like the one boxer says, Mike Tyson, everyone has a plan to get punched in the mouth. You're going to get punched in the mouth in the budget. Things are going to fluctuate. And so you have to figure out how you're going to adjust. If you don't have a plan at all, if you don't have a plan, then you're lost in space. So when I talk about Montclair, the plan, first and foremost, we look at our reading achievement and academic scores. They're flat across every demographic. Every demographic's flat for years. What's one of the biggest causes in that? Reading. How many kids read at above grade level in third grade? If you look across our data, it's not significant, and it should be, as us being I district. So we focus on those things. Dyslexia is something that's been a big piece that's come up quite a bit. And if you look at how we're budgeting around these pieces, the Fairleigh Dickinson University dyslexia training, or Gillingham, is funded through a grant. And the training is funded through a grant. So we're going to keep using that money to develop teachers, reading teachers, throughout our district in every school. But that's done not from our general fund, but through grants. So we have to really be thoughtful how you do this. Even with math instruction, we're partnering with Rutgers University and these other places around those pieces with professors who put into our grant monies to move forward. Now, this year was unique because acceleration became a big thing. I understand it. It's needed. We have to do it. It's going to take years. But the federal government's giving us some help. The state's giving us some help. So it's behooving to us to use those funds thoughtfully in a way. And I have my dream again. Kids stay in schools until 6:30. And then we have a little morning Saturday program for kids. But we fund it through the grants. But then we do it in a way that we get outside agencies like Brother to Brother, outside agencies like Imani, in NMDC, think of the YMCA, and we contract with them. And we say, hey, come help us meet the needs of our kids. Help us with this. How can we work together? Put an RFP together so we can give you these amount of money to help us with this. We'll give you our facilities, which is not going to really cost us anything. We have it open anyway. And let's move forward with it. So those are the ways you can increase what you're doing with limited funds, because as we said before, with health insurance going up, with taxes the way they are, you have to be aggressive to go out there and get funding to bring to your schools to continue to improve your resources for kids. But you also have to be looking at how things are going. So and one of the things I took this years ago, I needed to learn how to be a better superintendent. So my first superintendent job, I took the Kale program at Harvard. So I was taking that program, it's a 2.5-year program while I'm doing it in superintendency because I wanted to become better at the job. And I took this thing called Managing Evidence. Incredible professional development class. Few much you have to take it. But the best thing about that class was that you learn how to read evidence and data more so. I had it in my doctoral program, but it's good to re-see this over and over again, because you get to understand your monies you spend are finite and they can go away, or you're using it in the best way possible. And you understand that. What does that mean? So I'm notorious for assessing what we're doing when it comes to any programming, because one, we can actually tell the people we're working with, if we may adjust here, we may get better results for our kids. Or, hey, is the program really working for us or not? So these are the kind of things you have to really do, and you can do it in a very humane way. It's not like it's a gotcha. You need to work together with your partners to make sure you're actually giving them the proper resources so they can be successful. And then I believe in tying training too. What a great way of getting our kids quality is tying training we have for our staff with our partners too. So you have to think years ahead. And I always say, one of my friends and now colleague that used to work with me, who's now a superintendent in Munaki, would always say, let's just run the play and make adjustments. Do the fundamentals well, and things will play itself out. You do the fundamentals poorly, you're always throwing mud against the wall and looking for a miracle. So, and it's like that budgeting. If you're not thoughtful how you spend money, you'll spend it everywhere and you'll get no results.
Right.
So you have to really be pointed to. And one of the things we have to do is be in constant communication with the business office about what's going on with respect to the budget. The worst thing you can be in is in the deficit and have to look at making decisions around cuts, which is difficult, or reduction of staff, which is difficult. And so you really have to be thoughtful about how you do it. How do you not do harm and increase your services with this? And that means really digging into what's going on, efficiencies, and what's happening. And so one of the things we do is like look into our ratios, look into our scheduling, look into our staffing across the board, and say, okay, where are we efficient? Where aren't we? And where can we move things around and become more efficient? But you have to do it through communication and collaboration. So, we'll be meeting with principals coming up, and meeting with also the business administration to talk about how is this look in your school? How do you keep your magnet? How do you keep teaching and learning at top? How do you keep those things with what we have as a pool of money? And then one of my job is to go out and aggressively attack things. I believe in early childhood education, so I'm still aggressively attacking that. And if I'm going for the grant through the state, but if I can't get that, I'm going to go somewhere else and try to find the money to pull money in. So I'm not giving up because one thing may not be working out. I'm going to keep attacking, looking for monies out there. So that's my job as a superintendent, but also is to tell our principals, hey guys, we need to look at what we have. How can we work together on making this efficient and making it increasing our services, and also making sure we're meeting all our kids' needs academically. We want our kids to be able to compete in the world. One thing I'll say, one thing Mr. DeAndre and Miss Beatty and Miss Melissa did with us was wonderful. We needed to have a one-to-one program to accelerate our kids' learning and to keep them competitive. So we looked at our grants, and the ESSR has a portion of that where we can spend the money on that piece. So because of that, we're doing that. But being the great BA Mr. DeAndre is, he was very clear in our senior staffing today. It's like we have to sustain this over time, guys. So start thinking about how you're going to do that, sustain it over time.
So
It's not
just
a
to
one.
clarify for the audience, a one-to-one program means that we are able to provide a laptop to every student in the district.
Yes,
And sustaining it over time means laptops don't survive forever. So you need to budget a replacement cycle for those laptops to sustain a one-to-one program.
absolutely, absolutely. So these are some of the things we're doing, and we put it through a grant. And so, and now we have to sustain it over time. But being the BA is like we have to look at our budget, how we're going to do this piece. So those are kind of things we really try to tackle head on. And I talk about, staff reduction is difficult, hands down. It's hard, but we really need to look at how we're going to do it and do it thoughtfully in collaboration and be when we're there with our plans together, put it out transparently to people, say this is what we're doing and this is how we're doing it. This is why we're doing it.
Right.
And
those
everyone's
are
gonna,
go ahead.
no, not everyone's gonna always agree, but as long as we're doing it with and giving kids the services they need, expanding the services they need, and it's for children, I can live with some of it. So
So I'm obviously a business and operations guy and not an educator because my classroom management skills are weak, but I'm going to try to get us back to the lesson plan. And we've gotten some great information, but there are some concepts I want to make sure we cover, and I don't want to run out of time again. And you did actually hit on some of the things that I had in the lesson plan there at the end, because it does seem like every year we're dealing with scarcity, we're dealing with the need to make very hard decisions. And just kind of thinking about what drives those decisions, particularly when 80% of our expenditures of our budget is driven by staff, whether it's salaries or benefits. It's tied to that staff number. So a couple of concepts I wanted to touch on is in terms of identifying what the staffing need is for the district. There's a concept of zero-based budgeting. It was something that your predecessor, Dr. Parker, liked to speak about a lot. Is I'm not assuming that because this was your staffing structure and this is what you had this year, that's what you need next year. I need you to start with a blank slate and justify to me why you need this staffing, why you need this program, as if it was all new, as if it all had new next to it, and we have to evaluate it every year because of the scarcity. Is that something that you believe in as well, or is there kind of a variation on that?
there's a variation on that. And one of the reasons why it's a variation is because I believe in long-term planning. And so if that means every year you should be building off of or have an idea of what you need. So there shouldn't be any reason for me to say you don't have you have less than you have a deficiency, you have a lack of efficiency in your budget or in where you are. And that creates a surplus. Because once we get you to a point where you have efficiency and we're getting outside monies coming in, we shouldn't be spending things extra every year, having to find a way to reduce you every year. So, or find a way to you justify it every year, because you can justify to me every day. So one of the things we want to do is be in collaboration with principals around our goals, your magnet, teaching and learning, accelerating every child, whether you're a top flyer or someone who needs help, make sure every child's getting what they need to continue to grow, to be successful and compete. Working with places like Essex Community College and those things to make sure we get dual degrees, where you get associate's degree and also your high school diploma. So my belief is that if we are doing it right and we're hitting the monies at our goal academically through schools, then every year we look at your school, it should be, I mean, I would say this one time when I was in an interview, they asked me when I was a principal, so oh, it's a difficult time for you this year because you're scheduling. It's like, no, once the schedule was made, my schedule was the same for years. As long as we were making growth and moving forward, it was the same. We made tweaks here and there, but they weren't significant tweaks. And so we were more efficient how we did. And I think I made a statement once. If you don't have a goal, you'll spend more money on paper one year than you should. But if you have a goal and know where you're spending the money, paper won't be an issue to you because it'll be the same. The only issue may be the increases in salary of your staff members.
Right.
But that would be really the only thing that impacts where you're going. But if you're budgeting properly, you're getting the right grants to supplement things, those increases can be almost minute if you're getting money in to help you. If you're not, and you're just relying on your budget and your general, then you're going to find yourself in trouble because there's not enough money out there that you get from the taxpayers, from the state to sustain yourself over time. Like Emilio said earlier, Mr. DeAndre said earlier, we got 2.5, and we have, our other Christians are the same, but if you balance it out with your grants and financial money, you'll find a way. So my belief is a little bit different. If you're not justifying every day what you're doing, then you're wasting money. When we do our assessments of programming, if we're not really assessing it constantly, you find it drops off by the wayside. So you should be looking at things every quarter for what's working, what's not working. Waiting at the end of the year, you've lost a lot of people, you wasted a lot of money, and things just didn't go well. And by that time, that catch up will take you another full year to make it happen. So that's my personal belief.
Right.
I do believe though that schedules are critical because schedules in schools can determine really drives where things are going. And if you're not scheduling appropriately, you could be spending money in places where you're not even realizing you are.
Right. Let me kind of give some examples on that because I wanted to dig into that a little bit because I know that's a big topic of conversation this year as we look at the potential budget cut is, what do we talk about when we're talking about scheduling efficiencies, and what does that look like at elementary school? What does it look like in middle school? What does it look like at high school? If it's like it was when Melissa and I were building the budget, I know that our baseline for elementary school is that we're going to have a homeroom for every 24 kids in grades K to 5. And most of our buildings, just the nature of the facility and their capacity, that's going to mean 3 homerooms per grade every year at Watchung, at Northeast, at Bradford. But there is some swing at Nishwain and at Hillside because some years when we have a smaller cohort, we may need fewer homerooms in first grade than we did the year before. We may need more homerooms in second grade. So I know that that's one of the things that drives, where you put those homerooms in place. And then those homeroom teachers and the collective bargaining agreement dictates to some extent how you're going to use those related arts teachers, right? Because their prep periods and their lunch periods that they're entitled to tend to be when those kids are moving through to art, music, and PE. And you know how many homerooms, because at most of our elementary schools, they circle through those related arts as a homeroom, have to circle through PE in a week, have to circle through world language in a week. And that helps you determine the number of related arts teachers you need, right?
Right. And the one thing that can scare me is an increase all of a sudden in our student population, or decrease all of a sudden in your student population. That can impact you, but that's few and far between. I mean, that happens very rarely. So for me, that's how I look at the budgeting process. You have to work closely with your BA on this and your principals. So one of the challenges that we have coming up in the next week or two, because I made a promise to get some information out to families, into our community, into our schools within the next few weeks. One of the challenges is now doing that. We have Mr. Cooper has gone through with our principals and worked things out and talked about where we are. We've got some help doing that. Now the next step is for me to sit down with principals, sit down with the BA and Ms. Melissa, all of us all in a room, and say, all right, guys, this is what we are. These are our goals. This is where we should be going. How are we now spending our money thoughtfully to do this? We're bringing this to the table where it comes to extending the school year, with respect to summer schooling. We figured out how we're going to pay for that. We figured out how we're going to get extended from 3 to 6 right now. We're looking at the moon monies coming in from the state. Now, how are we going to do this with the rest of this piece? How are we going to now make these tough reductions? But we're going to do it thoughtfully with each other and compassionately. And it's in my goal coming into the next years is to be saying, hey, we can we're in great shape. We look wonderful. we may be able to do something in addition to, we have the monies for it. How now we can do something different, or they can adjust and help us in our goals with extra money. But for right now, I've really got to make sure that I can say that statement next year to all of us, and this, in that we're keeping ourselves above our revenues in our line 10s, and then looking at, well, I'm sorry, our line 10s are over expenditures, but looking at line 20s to get more line 20s in there, and then say it's going to outpace what we're going to spend on our revenues are. So that's the challenge, and it's not going to be easy, but it's doable. It's very, very doable. It's
So
possible, and it's not like something that's out there that's we can't get done.
yeah, so I want to give folks, we talked about elementary school. The schedule analysis obviously looks very different at the high school, for example, where no two kids have the same schedule over the course of 8 periods. You've got lots of different sections at various levels, in every course. So, at least when I was looking at schedules at the high school, what I was looking for is, are all of the teachers teaching the number of periods that they can be assigned by contract? And are those classes relatively full and enrolled? Because if you have, several teachers who are teaching less than the required number of periods, or are teaching classes with 10 students instead of 20 students, and they're teaching multiple classes with 10 students, that's when you start to see these efficiencies. I can offer these same classes and give the kids all the classes they need to be enrolled in with fewer heads, right?
Scheduling at a high school is something that's very, very difficult if you're not planned out very well. And one of the problems that can happen is that if you're not scheduling efficiency, you can have that where you have 5 or 8 kids taking the same class at a different time, then you have 15 kids. And if you don't combine those classes within a schedule, then what you have is someone teaching less than a full class, and still getting the benefits of that when someone is teaching a larger class. The other thing is that we've found out is that sometimes people don't have full schedules, and that's difficult to experience when you're in a deficit or looking at a deficit. So you have to make sure those things are there. And those are some of the questions that you have. Like we ask the questions, and we ask them the questions, well, what's your class sizes? And what's everyone's schedule? And looking into it. And we're looking at even at lunches, how lunches are staffed, and looking at how can we do that more efficiently at the high school. And those are critical things because we find out, well, we can probably do something here more efficient, but staffing lunching differently than paying this rate, rather we can pay something in a different rate. Looking at the importance of how we utilize and give our people, for instance, one-to-one initiative. Deputy Mayor Herlock said something really neat, and he kind of put it out there. Now with one-to-one, you can look at, not looking at textbooks anymore, you can look at how you can get curriculum on the computer, how you can get it paid through there.
Right.
So those are some of the things. And when you're talking about high school curriculums and the plethora of them all, from AP courses, and books become a situation where you have to buy the books for the course. If you can put the books online, and everyone's in a one-to-one, that takes away from those costs. Maybe you think, oh, that's a small thing. We'll put it over a time of 2,000 kids, and you'll see how small it really is. It can become pretty significant. So those are the things I've heard too. I've heard that some classes aren't fully staffed or don't have, up to 18 plus kids. I've heard 5 as a number before. And so those are things we're looking at. At the same time, the trick is, how do you do that and still give kids quality programming? So if I have a high flying student who's taking AP calculus, and there appears to be only 5 students in that class, how do we still give AP calculus to 15 students in one class? How do we then create that habit? And that's the challenge you have at a high school than you wouldn't have at an elementary or middle school.
Yeah. So with the middle schools, that's kind of tricky because of the house system, right? So, if in kindergarten, if you have 24 fewer kids in kindergarten next year, you can have 1 fewer homeroom. But when you've got houses, each with a science teacher, a math teacher, an English language arts teacher, and which one didn't I say yet? Science,
Social
English language
studies.
arts, social studies, and math. That's tougher, right? If you lose 24 kids or even 50 kids, you can't cut a math teacher and a social studies teacher necessarily. So how do you look at scheduling and efficiencies at the middle school?
Well, a couple of things. One, you have to hire differently. You look at staff members that have dual certification. One thing that makes elementary schools easier because the certifications, they usually typically a K-5. So you have to hire people who have dual certifications around different pieces. Math and science is something that comes kind of together sometimes. And you can look at those. But how do you do that? Really, you have to be able to understand what's coming up the pipeline. You see what's happening ahead of time. So I'm pretty sure Ms. Melissa and Ms. DeAndre, we can look at our student projections of what's coming in based on our preschool numbers and our numbers what's coming up, so we can then plan for that down the road. What gets people in trouble is they plan a year ahead. They plan that year. We have this happening this year, so we're gonna scramble. You should be thinking that 3 years down the road. What does it look like 3 years down the road? What's the enrollment in our kindergarten here? What's our enrollment? So I've been able to do that for some years to say, okay, 3 years from now, we're gonna have so many kids coming to the middle school. Our fifth grade was low. It's gonna be projected to be low in 3 years. How are we adjusting for that now? We have an individual we know is gonna not be needed there. What's their other certifications? How can we have that conversation with them in 2 years before, so we can move them to something else, rather than saying, oh, we don't need one, I'm gonna cut you, we're gonna cut your position. So you have to be thinking that way. Because when I want to hire somebody, my goal is to hire them to be permanent and to grow with them. It takes, they say, between 5 to 10 years for someone to be good at what their job. Teaching, you can take 7 to 10. So if you invest in a teacher for 7 to 10 years and you don't do the background work of what's coming up the pike, the money you invest in that person for 17 years, you completely wasted. And then the numbers change. You got to hire someone back in, maybe at a lower rate. Then you have to reinvest in an individual all over again to get them to the quality. So what you're doing is you're losing your quality. So if you're planning ahead of time, you can see these things. I'll give a great example. We had the early childhood grant, and we saw an increase in students coming in early childhood, people moving into the community because of early childhood, we thought, but what happened, we increased our population in our early elementary school tremendously, which means that they have an additional first grade classroom coming up in a few years. 2 years from the next, we're looking at 4-year-olds. So we start planning then on how we're going to do it. Where's it going to be? How are we going to put the room in? Rather than waiting to the year before and go, oh, we got a big class coming in now. What are we going to do? That causes chaos. So you should always be planning ahead of time. And the numbers you get from your population coming in, your projections, should always guide you on that. And it's with school, it's my belief, and I'll just my position. If you're not looking ahead, like I said before, 5 years, 4 years ahead, you can find yourself in some deep problems. So it's always good to have your goals, where you're going, but also be looking behind you going, okay, what's our population look like? What's happening, who's coming in, who's not coming in? And I'll give you a great example. 2008, I was in Massachusetts, love Massachusetts. Earthquake in Haiti happened. Overnight, our classes shifted. So at that time, we had to plan how we're going to manage this. Every year it got easier because we had solid numbers, but we didn't have solid numbers that first time. We went into massive spin, like how are we going to do it? How are we going to do it? How are we going to do it? After about 2 years, 3 years, that number dropped completely off. So we had staff members that were there who had no place to teach, really, because our ESL
happened in New York with Hurricane Katrina. I remember it because I was working in the New York City public schools at the time. Those, bubbles and drop backs.
So you have to really be thoughtful where you can control those plannings. I haven't had one thing like I haven't had an earthquake happen to me again in my career, but those things are possible. But if you're not planning ahead of time, those things are every year in some place. Every year, some places going, oh, we have this happening now. How can we do this? So planning, looking at your numbers. Numbers can give you a lot of guidance on a lot of things. You have to do some qualitative work, but numbers can give you a lot of guidance on things if you're looking at them carefully. So that's how I look at it. So when it comes to the middle school and something coming up, we should already have that idea, because we should be looking at our elementary schools. And then we should be looking at from there, how it's going to impact our high schools. I was in DLC today. I saw a wall of picture of students. The person stopped me and said, look, those students now are your 12th graders. So if we think
For those
that
who don't
way,
know, the DLC is our special education preschool within the pre-K building next to 22 Valley Road.
so if you think that way, these preschoolers will be high school seniors sometime soon. How many do we have there? And think thoughtfully like that, you will see yourself planning ahead of time. But if you don't think that way, if you're just going through the day-to-day motions, you're going to find yourself constantly going through the day-to-day weeds and motions and not having yourself together. So that's how I look at it personally, and that's how I look at budgeting and planning for schools. So
Thank you. That's really helpful, I think, as folks are thinking about what does this, analysis of scheduling look like, and what do we mean when we talk about efficiencies? One thing that comes up a lot also is scheduling and efficiencies with regard to paraprofessionals. I know that in Montclair, we have general ed paraprofessionals in kindergarten only. So each kindergarten class has an aide. But all of the other paraprofessional staffing is based on student IEPs, correct? And that's what determines the number of paraprofessionals you need. But some IEPs say that this child needs a one-to-one paraprofessional, in which case the scheduling is obvious and easy, one paraprofessional for this child. But then we have a lot of students whose IEP says they need a shared paraprofessional. So how does the determination of the number of shared paraprofessionals get done, and how do you look at that in terms of efficiencies?
it should be determined by the grade level in the scheduling. When that CST team and the principals are all engaged in this conversation with the parent and get to the agreement of what should be in an IEP, everyone in that building leadership should know where those classrooms are with the shared paraprofessionals. And it should meet the students, first and foremost, meet the students' IEP needs. That classroom should. And if it does meet all the needs, then the students should be placed in that classroom where they can share a paraprofessional. Where some places get in trouble, and we were still doing our homework, is when you don't understand that, and then kids are placed sporadically because you say they have a shared paraprofessional in their IEP, and that not in a classroom where there's another paraprofessional that can help them. Then you have to hire another paraprofessional and put them in the classroom. So it's really scheduling and knowing your environment and who's in your environment and the classrooms in your environment and placing them. But you also have to know how many students are in that classroom already. Are you meeting your threshold or not meeting your threshold? And so that's a statement that the principals and myself in the special education department and all of us together get around what's the best for our kids and how do we efficiently place them in a room where they're going to meet their needs with the shared paraprofessional. Now, if it's a one-to-one, it's an RIP. It's a one-to-one, it's an RIP. But whereas they're shared, you need to place them in an appropriate place where they're shared. But they have to meet the students' needs, have to meet their needs in their IEPs. Or some places get in trouble is where they place them in a room where there's not a shared, and you have to hire someone. And when you hire someone, you kind of own them at that point. And when you own them, there's healthcare, salary, the whole thing. So that's one of those things where you can find yourself in trouble. And so to look at that carefully and find it and say, oh man, how did this happen? How can we prevent this from happening? Because we're always going to have students coming up who are going to need IEPs. How do you prevent that from happening before again? And then how do you then schedule it appropriately? I feel that if we communicate well together and collaborate well together with all our departments. So I'll divert. I love organizational leadership. And so I listen sometimes to this podcast because talking about organizations. And there was a 1962 article I read. It was a really cool article about integrating systems. And some of the problems we talk about is the lack of integration. And so if you don't have one department integrating with the next department because their sub-environments are different, talking to each other, you don't have integration, which is going to then take away from your success. And success for us is success for the students. So it has to be integrated. And how do you do that? You have talented people talking to each other about what's going on in their sub-environments. So when they come together, they can then move forward. And so when you don't have that communication happening, you have a student getting placed in an inappropriate place, placed in an inappropriate place, and we have to put someone in there, hire someone in there to be there with them. If the integration is taking place, we're having great communication, collaborating, then that never happens. And so one of the things is that one of my things in organization development in leadership here is really understanding how we're integrating with each other. So one of my things I've learned in our senior staff meetings, I'm listening for the integration. We're integrating with each other, and are we connecting and driving things together to move things forward? And also, in our admins programming, I'm listening for, okay, we have an agenda around reading. How are we integrating this together? One of the things I've started to do is ask our current admins who have expertise in certain things to start integrating that by sharing it with their peers. So this is something that can call inefficiencies when you're not integrating and communicating each other, because then you're spending money differently in these two places where you could be coming together and spending money more efficiently. Hope that made some sense. But that podcast is great, and I've learned a lot of cool things in that podcast, and still get it and read it. So
I mean, one thing I remember absolutely from my years as business administrator is how important it is that the pupil services is communicating and coordinating with the school principals, with the business office, with the personnel office, and everybody knows what's going on, because if they're not talking to one another, then there are problems.
Massive problems.
So we've been letting Melissa off the hook too much, and there's one thing I'm going to toss your way, because I know you can speak to this. The topic comes up every year at budget time: breakage.
Yes.
So breakage is when you have an employee who makes a higher salary. Let's say they're a veteran teacher making $100,000 and they retire. And then the new teacher that you hire to fill that vacancy in kindergarten or AP science is likely going to be significantly younger in their career and going to fall at a different place on the salary guide, and may make $60,000 or $70,000, in which case you're saving $30,000 or $40,000 for the same classroom placement.
So there's I want to say almost like two types of breakage. There's breakage that we capture during the budget development, which would be anybody who has put in their retirement papers or potentially resigned up until a certain date, which we usually do about the end of February, right before we have to go to the board to have them board approve the budget to send to the county. So we capture that savings right away in the budget so that it reduces the deficit number that we have. So like you were saying, if we have a teacher that's currently making, or we're projecting for them to make $100,000 next year, and we obviously are not hiring that person right this minute because either we're going to have a vacancy, we don't have it right now, we're going to put in a vacancy position. We're going to remove the $100,000 from the budget, and we're going to put a vacancy in at $60,000 so that $40,000 was achieved right away. And then there's the other type of breakage that happens after budget development has finalized. And that breakage helps us fund, like you were saying, custodial overtime if we have a lot of snowstorms, or something new program we want to try to explore a little bit, or somebody did really well and they're going to get a promotion or something of that nature, or we had more people go get certification for something that we weren't anticipating. That breakage after the budget has been developed, then goes into the pot to help fund those types of things. And if it's not all used, then it ends up falling out at the end of the year and going back into fund balance to then fund the next year's budget process.
Right. So let me push back a little bit because I know that the MEA leadership pushes on this every year and I want people to understand it. So the MEA would often suggest that based on your experience over the last couple of years, that you are likely to realize about $600,000, $700,000, $800,000 in breakage after that cutoff date that you made in February. So if it's every year, if it's, 600, 700, why can't you throw $400,000 into the budget this year of that projected savings?
Because it's poor planning. Because if that person, just say you have 3 people, okay, that decide that through board approval, say I'm going to retire. And then come June, they say, you know what, something changed with my situation. I'm not going to retire. And they ask to rescind their retirement. Now I've lost $30,000 to $40,000 out of my budget and I have to find that. And if you do that too many times, you're looking at $100,000, $200,000 that you did not budget for because they put in they were going to put in their retirement papers. Like I know of several people that have verbally told me they're going to retire, but I haven't seen it board approved. And if it's not board approved, I don't consider it set in stone. And even sometimes when it's set in stone, it's not always set in stone, but that's very rare. Most people who say they're going to retire, they retire. But it's not good budget practice to anticipate retirements. It's just not, because if generally your retirements are on the higher end of a salary guide, and if they don't end up retiring and you planned on them retiring, you could shortfall your budget pretty bad.
And if and Brian, I've been in districts where what they have been able to do is work through that individuals who are looking to retire must submit their paperwork by a certain date to be considered with any retirement bonuses that are coming in. I use the word retirement bonus, sick leave paying out. So if you don't retire, if you don't put in your paperwork by a certain date, you now have to wait a full budget cycle so that the board can appropriately budget for that. So that's a mechanism that some districts have used in order to know exactly who's going to retire, so that they have to submit by a certain date. And if they don't submit by a certain date, they're still able to retire. But if they have a sick payout or any other benefits that coming to them, they have to wait a full budget cycle. And then that also helps with the conversation we're having right now about budget breakage, is that now you basically have a finite number of who is going to retire, and you can budget that because they're required to put in by a certain date. The flip side to that is that there are things here in Montclair that are not put into the budget. And Melissa hit upon some of them. Every year you have individuals that have a degree change. They can go from a BA 10 to a BA 30. We don't budget for that on an annual basis because, again, that's a real guesstimate as to how many people are going to change. So breakage that occurs sometimes after the budget is struck, as Melissa said, does go to pay for other items that you did not foresee coming. Now, could you budget for those? Yes. But here in Montclair, they do not budget. So some of the budget that occurs, or the breakage that occurs after the fact, goes to supplement some of those changes that are not budgeted for. And the toughest part is that question came up recently at one of our meetings about substitutes. How do you know what to budget for substitutes? Well, you look back at prior years, and I can tell you from my past experience, you do know, you can tell what year certain contracts were in the last year of their contract, because it always seems late late April, May, and June, you have a large number of people who take off for whatever reason. So you see that in certain years, and then the prior year, you did not see it. So there are different trends that occur. So you really don't know. So what's occurring on an annual basis with your substitutes? How many people are going to be on leave for maternity or paternity now? And the key is with that is some of those individuals have enough sick time that they stay on the rolls or on payroll for a period of time while their substitute is also being paid.
Right.
Again, how do you budget for that? How do you predict that? So to say that you can predict the number of retirees is not necessarily a true statement, just as you really
Because some
can't
costs will
predict
go
it.
up just as some costs will go down.
Exactly.
Mhm.
So you have to get to a point in time where you say, we're cutting off the breakage number. And we've reported that in our meetings where we said we went from January through the end of February, and we had this number that sits out there of 25,000. And for some reason, people are saying that's the only breakage you had all year. And
No.
it's not,
Yeah.
that's not the statement being made. That's just the statement was, these are the number of people we captured from that point in time that we last did it to now was an additional 25, because we're in the process of showing how we reduced our budget from the last time we spoke. So it's a moving target. There are mechanisms you can put in place if you want to have a finite number in the breakage. But those all things you have to work through your negotiations process to put those in place.
So Mr. DeAndrea, if I'm understanding correctly, and please let me know if I'm wrong, you're actually not recommending that we do something like incentivize people to announce their retirements by that cutoff date, because that would leave us with a little bit less unexpected gain that would then offset the other kind of breakage, which is the unexpected expense.
No, because then if we're going in that direction, then we can start budgeting on that other side also. So yes, if we move towards one, then you make the adjustment in the other. So it's a balancing act. So if you can get people to ensure that they have to put in by a certain date, then you adjust your budgeting to say, okay, we know that people are going to retire after, in our case, a March date. We know that, yes.
Sure.
But we know that we also going to have people who are going to have degree changes and all. So we don't budget on one side, we don't budget on the other. And at the end, you hope that it balances out in the end with it. And again, you have people that leave for resignation purposes. So there are a lot of things that come into play with that breakage number. But to say in February, well, we're going to expect 10 retirements and another 10 resignations. So we'll take $500,000 out of the budget for that. That, to me, that is not prudent budgeting, because you never know what other unexpected things may come. You could have, as Dr. Pons says, when you start evaluating your class sizes, there may be kids that may want to take on an architectural program that you've had, and all of a sudden you had 15 kids.
Teacher.
Yeah, you had 15 kids one year, and all of a sudden now you have 35, 40 kids. Well, you really didn't know that in February because you don't do your scheduling and your course offerings until another period in time. So those are adjustments that you have to have available money in your budget to develop it. It'd be wonderful if we can develop our budget for September of 21 and say you have to finalize your budget by May 31st of 21. You're only looking at a three-month window, but we're so far in advance of that, it's difficult to have kids schedule their classes. Can you imagine trying to have kids schedule their classes in sometime in November for the following September?
Yeah.
Those kind of things. So those are the challenges where you make those adjustments in your budget of things that occur after the fact.
So let me jump in because we've got, I think, about 5 minutes left, and there are a couple of
time's
questions
flying.
in the chat that are also related to a couple of questions that come up
Okay.
regularly during our budget meetings. And that is, we seem to have a repeated pattern where at budget time, we have the budget deficit, we cut, let's say it's 40 heads, let's say it's 20 paraprofessionals and 20 teachers. And then in July, August, and September, we are rushing and we are hiring many of those positions back. So we haven't actually cut headcount, but we've put all of these teachers and paras through the trauma of getting pink slipped, not knowing that they're going to have a job. And then maybe in July or August or September, they get the call and they're rushing back into their classroom. And then that also gets into the question of when is the best time for us to be doing our hiring so that we're getting the best pool of teachers. And are we kind of harming ourselves with this repeated pattern of hiring in July, August, and September? And is that because that's when we know what the breakage is and who we can hire back?
I'll start with, it's always best to hire in the springtime. It's always best to hire in the springtime. Hire in the summertime is a very dangerous thing. Many times people have already decided where they're going to go and they've already made plans, particularly if they're talented and they're already prepping. In the summertime, they're usually doing something different. It's very, very hard. And it's very hard to find really, really top quality at that point, because many times people are already in their places.
So we really should be looking to incentivize the announcement as early as possible, never mind the budget issues, just to improve our hiring process.
Those vacancies earlier.
Right. If we know the vacancies sooner, then we can start looking for them in the spring rather than having to wait for the summer.
Yeah, and that's something that has to be go through the negotiations in the union contract.
Right.
Which has to happen now anyway. So if we're going to do that, now is the time to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, just because we say, let go 10 people, that doesn't mean that another 5 or 10 didn't decide to resign or retire, that we're going to have to backfill anyway.
Right.
So, just because, we're going to cut positions doesn't mean that other people aren't just going to leave anyway for their own reasons, and we're not going to have to fill those positions at the last minute. So I personally don't look at the hiring in July and August as, well, we cut these positions, so now we have to fill them anyway. People are constantly moving.
Right. I'm sorry. I guess I wasn't clear. That's not what I was saying. I was going back to the idea.
Yeah. No, I understood that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no, just on Brian's point, the conversation was out there that, we always cut in during the budget, we're cutting, and then all of a sudden we're doing a massive hiring, in July, August, September, whatever it ends up being. But again, like I was saying, it's not necessarily because we cut, it's because, maybe somebody was a paraprofessional and they were looking for a teaching position, and now they're going to be a teacher at another district, and now we have to backfill that paraprofessional position that we were keeping. That could be, some of the instances of us doing the hiring over the summer. But I do agree with you that, having retirement numbers earlier is better than having them later.
And you also, I'm sorry, John, Dr. And you also have to be mindful that not when someone, and specifically when individuals resign, the assumption is if someone resigns and that the person who replaces them is coming in at less money than the person who resigned. That's not also always true either. So you have to be mindful of that. You may lose a young teacher, but the best replacement that comes in may be someone with 5 or 6 years experience, and that's the best qualified person. And you may need to allocate additional funds to get that best qualified candidate. So you have to be mindful of that as resignations occur. That's generally not true with retirements, but you may have that situation when people resign. Sorry, Dr. Pons.
No. Thank you, Ms. DeAndre. So one of the things is very important for me as an educator to have anticipated openings in the spring. So we can bring quality people in and also be able to backlog if something happens with someone who happens to leave. So I had had 3 great candidates here, is only able to hire 1. Someone just left, so now we have 2 other people we can choose from that we've interviewed. That's critical. The other piece of it is there always going to be some sort of some kind of chaos when it comes to hiring people within the school system. Someone could leave it in the last minute, but the more you have backfilled, I always call you have your file of people that you've interviewed that you think quality, were quality people. Just for some reason they didn't get to the next point. There was someone who just had a little bit more experience. You always pull that file out. You have communications with professors at different universities, schools. You call people up. He says, hey, I got something I'm anticipating. Who do you have there you think are quality? You have your other colleagues you call around, and we send emails to each other. Met a quality candidate here. If you have anything open, there's quality candidates out there. And you ask for that, and we call each other up. Our colleagues say, hey, do you have anyone that you would like, or do your principals have anyone they would like for us to talk to?
That's not called poaching?
Oh, well, if you call your colleague first, no. If you don't call your colleague, you may get a phone call for them saying, what are you doing?
Yeah.
But the principal that we have at Edgemont, I'm excited about. She's coming in. Her superintendent and we are friends. So, and she is high quality there for him. So you can only imagine how tough that phone call was. He gave me a hard time for 15 minutes, and then we started lighting up. So, but you have to call your colleagues, and you have to communicate with each other about talent out there, and go from there. But it's critical that we have to be able to plan earlier for things, because planning in September and August is difficult for a school to function well. But Mr. DeAndre's got a great point. When you have classes like architecture, or classes like we hired someone, I believe, this year. The reason why I rang my mom, because of the person who was highly qualified, and they cost more money. They simply cost more money coming in to be hired because of what they taught and their quality. And as our HR director said, and Mr. Young would say, he would say, hey, you remember, Jonathan, it's about the kids, right? So we have someone who's highly qualified who's going to help our kids. That's a tough way for me to. You want to get me something? You want to get through me something? You say those words, you can probably get just about anything you want. But it's very, very important to plan early as possible to get these things done. And spring's the best time. Another thing, I think we had a question around retirements that we were talking about. It's always the earlier we know, the better off we are. In the same time, we have to go within guidelines of, and we can't ask questions. And
tap somebody on the shoulder and say, you're getting up there and you're eligible.
that would get me sued.
No.
Yeah. And that only works with Supreme Court justices.
Yeah.
And the other part that also helps when knowing the retirements in advance is we do have a line item that we have set aside for employee. We call it Melissa, under employee benefits. We have the one line item.
Other employee benefits?
Other employee benefits. That's our line item that we use to forecast how much we may have to pay out in sick pay. So if you have retirement by a certain date, now you have a definitive number that you can actually put there. So there are other areas that impact if you know certain things in advance. So you can have your postings and your openings out earlier for those individuals. You now have areas that you can develop into your budget to get real finite breakage numbers prior to a certain date. Your other employee benefit line item, now you have a more definitive number when you have things that say you must do it by a certain date. Not saying you're not going to get it, but you're now not going to get it at this point in time. You're going to get it at a different point in time. So those are all things that you can start to develop as you have the appropriate things in place, and the staff. And with that goes having the appropriate staff to help you internally develop those kind of strategies to get to that point. So there's a lot that goes around breakage, and it's no disrespect to anyone. Yes, you can say cut 500, but then you have to have the ability to say, well, and then we have to look into other areas that we don't budget in that we may have to increase on that line item. to try and track that. And one thing that we did this year is we added a separate line item for long-term subs.
Right.
We wanted to be very conscious to track that, because that seemed to be an area that we weren't able to see as to how much were we actually spending on long-term substitutes and versus the day-to-day substitutes, because that gives you a different trend analysis that you can now start looking at and start your budgeting process better to know how many long-term substitutes you may have on a regular basis also. So it's a balancing act when it comes to breakage. Every different districts do things in different ways, and so it is a balancing act.
I appreciate it. So, the chat thinks that they've given you the first point for the negotiations with MEA, incentivize those early retirements. I want to thank you guys so much for giving us another 90 minutes tonight. I want to thank the folks in the audience who joined us. And again, we are recording this, so we'll be able to get it out soon for you to review, and then hopefully available for the rest of our community as well. I think it's critically important to make sure the community understands the budget process and understands what goes into it. We're super thankful that you've shared so much information and insight with us.
And Brian, if you don't mind, there is one question that came up on the chat that I just like to quickly address, and we talked about it earlier about enrollment.
Right.
We have to be mindful that enrollment, when numbers fluctuate up and down, for a district of this size, if you see a movement of 100 students or 150 students, yes, it sounds like a lot, but when you take 150 students over 13 grade levels, it breaks down to so small that it may not have a major impact on the reduction of staff. So I want individuals to be mindful of that. I saw it come up in the chat in that regard. So
if it was concentrated in 2 grades, maybe that would be something different.
That would be something. But if you have a concentration and a reduction of students across 13 grade levels, they have to be all in one building at one grade level to have an impact. So I want people to be mindful of that as numbers jump up and down. I do know that if you were a school district in Middlesex County in the mid 90s, they saw numbers coming in thousands of students because of all their development. That's a tough time. That's a difficult thing to plan for. But when you have fluctuations as we've had in Montclair outside of the current year because of the pandemic, fluctuations of 50 to 75 students across all those grade levels, it really doesn't have an impact on your staffing, because unless it's specifically concentrated to one school and a grade level. So I want people to be mindful of that. So with that, then hope you don't mind. I just saw that and I thought that was important since we were talking about enrollment earlier.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a nice night.
Bye-bye.
All right. To join breakout room. Yes, we'll stay.